U.S. President Joe Biden is reportedly removing military assets from the Gulf. Thus, even as Washington still considers Iran a threat in the region. Is this a shift in military strategy? And what does it mean for security in this volatile area? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Hashim Mahalbarra. U.S. President Joe Biden has ordered the Pentagon to remove some military assets and forces from the Gulf. That's according to a report by the Wall Street Journal. At least 3 Patriot anti-missile batteries have reportedly been withdrawn, including one from a base in Saudi Arabia. Biden has pledged to recalibrate U.S. Saudi ties since taking office in January, including freezing the sale of some weapons Riyadh uses in the war in Yemen. But his administration also says it does not want to destroy the relationship. It says it will still continue to help the kingdom defend itself against increasing attacks from Yemen and Iraq. Saudi officials have not commented on this, while the Americans say the decision was taken to meet military needs elsewhere. We'll bring in our panel shortly to discuss this further, but first, let's take a closer look at the U.S. military presence in the Gulf. As of late last year, there were about 50,000 American troops across the region. That's down from about 90,000 at the height of the tensions between Donald Trump's administration and Iran in 2019. In October that year, the U.S. deployed nearly 3,000 troops to Saudi Arabia. But now, with the possible removal of the Patriot anti-missile batteries and permanent aircraft carriers, up to several thousand military personnel could also leave soon. Let's bring in our guest in Washington, D.C., Douglas Ollivant, a retired Army officer and senior fellow with the Future of War project at New America. In London, Andreas Craig, assistant professor in the Defence Studies Department at King's College London. He's also co-author of Surrogate Warfare, The Transformation of War in the 21st Century. Also in Washington, Hussein Ibish, a senior resident scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. Welcome to you all. Douglas, is the U.S. rethinking military positioning in the Middle East, or is it just a simple act of reorganizing military assets?
So I think there's 3 different things going on here. One is a simple matter of military necessity. The number of Patriots and to a lesser extent aircraft carriers that have been put in the Gulf is simply unsustainable. Even if we wanted to retain that kind of presence, it's simply not sustainable to surge that level of assets for that long. I think second, this is a message to the region that the United States is rethinking its military posture and that the region is no longer the United States priority. And I think, interestingly and more subtly, internal to the U.S. government, this is a message from the White House to the Pentagon, to Central Command, to those who do Middle East policy, that the United States government is giving a pushback signal inside the government to those who do Middle East policy, that again, this is no longer the priority.
All right, Andreas, for many, this could be an indication that Biden is delivering on an election campaign promise he made, which is about the need to rethink the way the administration should be dealing with Saudi Arabia.
Well, yes. I mean, it's a very much a tightrope walk that the Biden administration is doing here. Because on the one hand, they obviously promised that they would, kind of rethink and recalibrate the relationship with the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, and trying to put some distance between the administration and the Crown Prince, and obviously making a clear break from what happened previously between Trump and MBS, especially with the Khashoggi report coming out. But at the same time, obviously, the Biden administration, as Douglas rightly said, Saudi Arabia remains a very important strategic partner of the United States. So, you have to strike a balance here, and I think that's what Biden is trying to do. The message that was sent last week already, that the U.S. administration would only support defensive support for the Saudi military to ensure that they cannot use them of any material support offensively in the war in Yemen, again, is part of that. But obviously now withdrawing what are essentially defensive weapons and weapons that are used for deterrence against Iran, I think sends the wrong message at the wrong time.
Hussein, is Yemen one of the main reasons why the Americans are rethinking their military presence and particularly the support for Saudi Arabia? Because Biden himself has been critical during the campaign of the war in Yemen.
Yes, but this is not a manifestation of that. Okay, everything my colleagues have said is exactly right. And the word Iran finally came up at the very end of my colleague's last comment. But to me, and I agree with everything Douglas said about internal and external messages and all of that's absolutely correct. But I think the biggest aspect that is of U.S. policy that's being reflected here is the desire to reduce tensions with Iran. Yes, there's an overall intention to draw down from the Middle East to redirect to great power conflict with China. Yes, there was an unsustainable surge in 2019, at the last 6 months of 2019 and into 2020 against, but why was there a surge? And that's being drawn down now. Well, it was precisely because of a rise in tensions with Iran that was the result of the clash between maximum pressure and maximum resistance from Iran. And I think the administration is pushing very hard to move away from that posture of confrontation with Iran. So I think other U.S. policy towards Saudi Arabia have reflected more the desire of Biden and other Democrats to draw a new relationship with Saudi Arabia or recalibrate based on Yemen. This, I think, ultimately has to do with posture towards Iran.
Douglas, Hussein spoke about the Iranian angle in this particular move. And this is the problem, I think, from a Saudi perspective and from many leaders in this part of the world. Trump came in and he said, you know what, Obama messed up a big deal in the Gulf region, and that emboldened the Iranians. I have to show them an aggressive push. Biden comes in and says, I need to show some sense of overture towards the Iranians. The Saudis will definitely say, you know what, this is the wrong message to send at this particular time because it just ultimately will further embolden Iran.
Certainly that's the Saudi message. I totally agree with what, again, both of my colleagues here on the program have said. This is about Iran, and partially that's the internal messaging I was talking about. Central Command and again, the Pentagon offices that manage the Middle East have been seen as the Iran hawks. And so I think this is a message from the White House to the Iran, the central location of the Iran hawks inside the United States government, that this is no longer the intention of the White House to keep up this level of tension. Although, as we all know, they're kind of struggling to find a politically acceptable way to downplay that tension.
Andreas, could it also be a realization among the top strategists in the U.S. administration that it's about time to downsize the presence of the U.S. military in the Middle East because realities on the ground have completely changed? So why should we be bogged down in this part of the world forever?
I think they're on this kind of path of, there's some sort of path dependency that goes back to the Obama administration, where the U.S. has said, we are now delegating the burden of conflict of the Middle East to our partners in the Middle East. And that also means help to self-help. That also means that Saudi Arabia has to take care of its own security, its own defense. Military aid will be provided to do that. And obviously the Saudi military, when there is one branch that is good in the Saudi military and actually operational and effective, it is actually the air defense and ballistic defense units of the Saudi armed forces, which have been trained and supported by the U.S. military. And at the same time, it's about burden sharing, and meaning that the U.S. will no longer carry the burden for defense of the Gulf. And that's the message that's been sent to partners in the Gulf all throughout the Obama administration, but also kind of through the Trump administration, despite some rhetoric. If you look at action on the ground, it meant the United States no longer look at the Middle East as the strategically most important region of operations. And that means local partners have to adopt more of that burden.
Hussein, but this is the problem with the strategic review of force placements around the world. This is something that the Americans did in the past, but they had to backtrack and send even more troops into the region, particularly in 2019 with the war with Iran?
Yeah, I mean, that can easily happen again. Look, the United States is a bit overstretched, right, globally. And so there's been an intention, I would argue, going back to the second George W. Bush term, to draw back from the Middle East. And every president, Obama in 2 terms, and Trump in 1 term, and now Biden, wants to redirect from the Middle East in general and the Gulf in particular, and pivot towards great power competition with China, which is absolutely right in theory. The problem is that the Gulf region is the beating heart of the global economy, and the South and East Asian economies that are at the heart of great power competition. So if you pivot to Asia, you pull the Gulf with you in tow, right, in a certain sense. Now, you can always back away entirely and leave a vacuum or open the door for further Chinese encroachment, but that carries its own costs. The other thing is that there's a downside for the United States to burden sharing. It's great, except that Yemen is kind of exhibit A in what burden sharing can look like. You say, well, you guys take care of it. The Saudis go ahead and intervene in Yemen, and now the United States doesn't like the way that looks. And I mean, I think for very good reasons. But the point is, there's a mixed message here, which is you do it. No, don't do it your way, do it our way, but you do it. It ultimately doesn't fit together very well. And I think a balance still has yet to be struck here.
Okay. Douglas, one of the key components of military positioning for decades was basically the presence of military bases. That's where you would send troops, equipment, weapons, bracing for what could happen next. Could that also become obsolete in a way or another in the near future? Because when you say that you are pulling out, withdrawing, one of the questions that you have to bear in mind, what shall I do with bases?
No, you bring up a very good point. We've all been talking about the obsolescence of our strategic assumptions. All these conventional forces are really good at deterring conventional threats, but there really aren't any in the Middle East anymore. It's hard to think of 2 armies internal to the Middle East that might clash with each other. The threats that come from Iran are non-conventional. It's their proxy forces, it's their missiles, and potentially their nuclear forces, none of which respond very well to an aircraft carrier. So it's time to have some serious rethinking about both managing our presence in the Gulf and our competition in the Gulf. I mean, we just saw in the last week that China is moving very forcefully into the Gulf, but they're not doing it with military presence. You can't counter a China-Iran trade agreement with another aircraft carrier. So we're going to have a lot more creative thought as to how the United States manages its presence and conducts its strategy in the Middle East region.
Andreas, the problem here is that when you withdraw or when you recalibrate, you give the people the impression that you're living a world in order and moving to another more chaotic world. But you look at this part of the world, it's still the same set of challenges and problems. ISIS is still there, Syria is still having problems, Yemen is still another issue, Libya is still another issue. You're talking about a world that needs to be put into order before moving forward.
Well, to be honest, the Middle East is probably in a greater state of instability than it has been over the last 2 or 3 decades. But beyond that, I think the U.S. has already gone into a new phase of engagement in the region. And that's one of what I call surrogate warfare in my book, which, this is how the Iranians do it. Delegate to local surrogates, let them fight on your behalf. And the U.S. responds by saying we delegate to local partners and local non-state actors to fight on our behalf. And rightly, as Douglas said, an aircraft carrier doesn't have anything, any kind of weight in that sort of surrogate confrontation. But then at the same time, the Americans are saying, they want to push back against China in part of that great power game. The issue is, as Douglas already touched upon, the issue is the Chinese actually struck some very strategic deals with partners in the region. First and foremost, the deal with the Iranians, which is a 25-year strategic relationship based on up to $400 billion of investments from China into Iran. They struck a deal with Saudi Arabia, where it's about investments into Agenda 2030, again, billions of dollars of investment. And they struck a deal with the UAE, which is about creating a vaccine within the UAE that, again, it increases the foothold of China. But the foothold that China is increasingly building in the region is not one that's based on the military domain. It's a whole of government approach. And again, that's where I think the Americans are lacking. The Americans don't understand how to do a whole of government approach in the same way that the Chinese do.
Hussein, if you suddenly decide that this is about time for me to consider, for example, China to be the long-term security challenge for the United States of America, this is something that will definitely have to have some implications on the way the Americans have to reorganize themselves and build up their presence in different parts of the world.
I mean, no question. And everything that my two colleagues have said is exactly right. But there is one exception to the asymmetrical threat pattern that Douglas has described, which is maritime security in the Gulf. There's a big dispute among American strategic thinkers right now about whether the Fifth Fleet and the permanent stationing of large naval forces based in Bahrain in the waters of the Gulf is necessary to maintain maritime security in the Gulf waters itself, the incredibly crucial, economically crucial waters of the Gulf, and to keep the Strait of Hormuz open. Whether you think you need that kind of presence or not, somebody is going to have to create a security structure that ensures the free flow of commerce through the Strait of Hormuz and an orderly system in the maritime waters of the Gulf. Right now, it's a combination of ad hoc understandings backed up by the presence of the Fifth Fleet. If you want to shift away from the traditional model, you will have to figure out a sustainable long-term modus vivendi to ensure maritime security in the Gulf waters. Otherwise, the U.S., I think, is naval presence going to be necessary to continue.
Douglas, if we are to shift away, if the Americans are to shift away from that model that has been prevailing for quite some time in this part of the world, could it be an indication that perhaps the Arctic, the Pacific, and the Asia could be the next battlefields where the Americans will have to fight for their supremacy?
I don't think battlefield is quite the right word, but certainly the United States is going to be competing all kinds of places with the Chinese. And again, my colleagues have more or less summed this correctly. You know, the United States is not configured for this. Every Chinese aid and development worker sees him or herself as the vanguard for larger Chinese business. I don't think anybody in U.S. aid thinks that way, but they need to start thinking that way if we're serious about this whole of government approach. I'm going to differ slightly with Ibish on the presence of the Fifth Fleet. I think the United States is still thinking as an energy consumer and not as an energy producer. Look, Texas is competing with markets in Asia, is competing with Saudi Arabia for markets in Asia to export oil. And in some ways, the Fifth Fleet is underwriting the geopolitical risk of buying Saudi Arabian oil. I'm not sure if we really start thinking strategically that that's going to make sense, particularly for Texans.
Andreas,
well, that's the argument I was referring to.
Go ahead, Ibish. Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
No, I was just saying that's precisely the argument that I was referring to that many people are making.
Andreas, Biden made it quite clear that he will definitely need to rebuild ties with NATO. And we're talking about NATO, we're talking about Russia at the same time, because that's where the Western thinking has been focusing for quite some time, which is the need to contain the Russian buildup. Could this be an indication that in the near future we will be seeing the Americans dealing with two key players here, Russia on one hand, China on the other?
I don't see any of that engagement happening when it comes to Russia. Quite on the contrary, I think it's one of confrontation. But again, Russia doesn't feature. I mean, when you speak in Europe, obviously Europeans and NATO partners in Europe constantly talk about Russia, not so much about China. I think there's a huge divergence there between how the threat perception of China in Europe is a different one than the United States, and when it comes to Russia, there's a different threat perception in the United States than there is in Europe. So I think as Europe is more confrontational towards Russia, the U.S. is more confrontational when it comes to China. And I think there's a huge divergence within NATO of how to deal with China in this during this period, you know, because there are a lot of European partners, NATO partners as well, who are opening up towards China, becoming part of the One Road, One Belt initiative, selling out very strategic assets to China. And there is very little that the United States can do about it. So the competition is about an alternative. So I'm not saying that China is substituting the US, but it's supplementing, and that in itself could be a long-term threat.
Hussein, this is one of the problems with shifting the burden of defending territories, particularly overseas. You have two options here. Either you start training those troops, like in the case of Saudi Arabia, or selling them more advanced weapons to be able to defend their own territory. The caveat here is some of those weapons could end up being used the wrong way, and this is the dilemma.
Yeah, and in fact, the Yemen war already shows that it's not being used necessarily in the wrong way, but from the point of view of many Americans, in the wrong way, not necessarily for the wrong purpose, but in a way that's counterproductive and ineffective, and even at times morally indefensible, right? So at the same time, if you're really going to shift to burden sharing, you're going to have to accept more of that than you want, and striking the balance is very difficult. I do think it's important to say that the Biden administration is working on, they've got this Tiger team going, this ad hoc group of defense experts to look into more sales, training, and technology transfer to help the Saudis defend themselves. The line between offensive and defensive in the military is very, very blurry.
Douglas, we keep talking about armies as if they were entities disconnected from this part of the world. When you look at our modern life challenges, pandemics and climate change are perhaps the biggest challenges that we are facing. Don't you see that this could be the moment to rethink the very notion of armies in their substance, in their form, in their identity, and in their mission?
Well, certainly, and I think in some ways we already see that. As I alluded to earlier, it's really hard to picture a conventional war in the Middle East today. It's very hard to imagine Iraq picking up and invading Kuwait again. It's almost impossible to imagine Syria or Egypt trying to launch a ground attack to invade Israel. Those are just not things that are very thinkable in the region for a host of reasons. Peace accords, lack of capability, the instability inside the country. But nonetheless, it's more or less unthinkable. And so the security challenges are very, very different. The one thing I do want to respond to is, as we build up these Saudi and other Gulf states, Saudi, Emirati, et cetera, military capabilities, we have to realize that Iran sees its unconventional capabilities, its missiles, its support of proxy forces, as its counter to those capabilities. So as we move into a place where we start to imagine negotiating with the Iranians about their missile program, about their support for proxies, what are the Gulf states going to be willing to come to the table and negotiate with to give up?
Indeed.
And one thing we know about states is they don't unilaterally disarm.
Andreas, if we are to move forward into the future, it seems that with artificial intelligence, we won't be needing hundreds and thousands of troops and aircraft carriers anymore in the near future. It will depend on a larger extent on whether and what kind of smart weapons you will have.
Absolutely. Yeah. So that's my whole point about, if you look at gray zone operations that are taking place, everything, any sort of competition at the moment in the Middle East, as everywhere else, is in the gray zone. And, the synergies that China is building are not just in the domain of trade and economy, but also in information technology sharing and synergies, particularly between UAE and China. The integration is around information technology. So already China has is providing the UAE with capability that the Americans are not sharing with the UAE, and these kind of synergies will be more important moving forward. Again, in a time when the US is entirely focused on conventional military.
Gentlemen, we'll have to leave it there. Douglas, Olivant, Andreas Craig, Hussein Ibish, I really appreciate your contribution and your time. Thank you. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com, for further discussion. Go to our Facebook page, that's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashim Mahalbara, and the entire team here in Doha. Bye for now.